Well, it is the top of the hour, so we are going to get started. So excited to see so many individuals, so many familiar names in the chat who are introducing themselves. So welcome everybody. My name is Jennifer Harris and I am a Senior Portfolio Manager with the Weichert Center, which is a unit of the Forum for Youth Investment. And I'm excited, just delighted to be able to be here today with some great presenters to be able to engage in some great conversations as it relates to summer. Summertime, you know, provides us a unique opportunity for community partners and schools and families and young people to work together to provide programs and services that promote the social, emotional, and cognitive development of youth. And so today what we are going to do is we're going to have a little time to focus on a 2019 report that was released by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine that was titled Shaping Summertime Experiences, Opportunities to Promote Healthy Development and Well-Being for Children and Youth. And so briefly, I'm going to introduce our panelists that are going to be with us today, who bring a lot of wealth of background in this content area. We're going to start first with Deborah Maroney. She's the Managing Director at the American Institute for Research, otherwise commonly known as AIR. There she is the Director of Youth Development and Supportive Learning Environments. And her real background is in methodological expert as it relates to implementation sciences in the context of both rigorous research and the design of program evaluations. You'll also see, we also have Chris Smith, who is the President and Executive Director of Boston After School and Beyond. He brings tons of experience, over 2 decades of work in creating and scaling and leading cross-sector partnerships in education and workforce development. And so under his leadership, Boston After School and Beyond has developed a nationally recognized model of summer learning that improves student outcomes and really helps to build a citywide program performance measurement system that both is cultivated in a network of 300 programs that serve over 21,000 youth. So welcome both of you. We're excited to have you here. So we're going to just go over a couple of logistics before we get started. So please feel free to submit. We know we're doing lots of introductions. We have a lot of people that are registered for this webinar today. So far, we have over 500 people in attendance. So feel free to submit your question and comments using the chat feature. Some of the slides that I'll be sharing with you today is really just about providing some background context as it relates to the report that we're going to be talking about and highlighting some of the recommendations that Chris is going to talk about as it relates to the work that Boston After School and Beyond has done. But really the majority of this is really around an unscripted conversation at the very end. And that's where we're going to really welcome your questions. It's already been noted this session is going to be recorded and we'll make it available early next week. Okay? So here's another look of our presenters, how they look in their pictures with their backgrounds, and we're excited to kick things off. And so I'm going to actually turn this over to Deborah Maroney. She was actually served, much like Chris did, on the National Academies of Sciences Committee on Summer Learning and Adolescent Development to allow her to kind of kick us off and talk more about this report. Deborah.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to the Forum for Youth Investment for having Chris and I here today. We're really excited to share some of the conclusions and recommendations from the report, but as Jennifer mentioned, also thrilled to have this opportunity to have real talk as advertised about how these findings and recommendations relate to summer 2020, right around the corner. So I don't know about you, Chris, but this was my first opportunity to serve on a National Academies of Sciences committee. So it was a new experience for me. And I think the process was rather interesting. I believe in 2016, the National Academies of Sciences brought together a workshop. And as I was seeing many friends sign into the chat box, I remember some of you being at that workshop, where the National Academies really explored whether or not it was a good time to look into the research opportunities and gaps as it related to summertime and child and family well-being. And indeed, as a result of that workshop, they decided it was worth a deeper dive. And with the generous support of the Wallace Foundation and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, endeavored to pull together a consensus committee that Chris and I were a part of to really carry out this charge. Jennifer, would you mind advancing? Thanks. And so this was our statement of task, which was modified a little bit from the beginning, but you can see it up here on the screen that our charge was to examine summertime experiences affecting school-age children. We did put parameters around that from rising kindergartners through seniors in high school. It was tempting to go beyond that, but the charge was broad enough. Across 4 areas of well-being: certainly academics and opportunities for enrichment, which have been well studied, social and emotional learning and development, physical, mental health, and health promoting behaviors, and safety and risk taking. So you see this ambitious charge up on the screen, and the National Academies really endeavored to pull together a diverse committee that represented all of these areas. So Chris and I, who've partnered over the years and known each other from our shared field for a long time, had the pleasure of working with other committee members from university-based researchers and city planning and medicine. From the corporate sector, there was someone really interesting from the Walt Disney Corporation who was over all of the health initiatives at Walt Disney, to a gentleman who was an advocate in the juvenile justice space in Massachusetts. So together, we really learned a lot from each other, and also brought in these diverse disciplines to inform our charge in answering these questions. Would you mind clicking? Sorry, thank you. And so we really came to these 7 overarching conclusions, and I am going to go through them in a little bit of detail. And as I do that, I'm just going to ask, I know so many of you, and I know that for many of you, these conclusions might not be front page news, but as we go through the conclusions, Chris and I were really hoping you would think about 2 things. One is how these conclusions might resonate with other stakeholders that you work with, other partners that you work with in the allied youth fields who might not be as familiar with structured summertime experiences. And the second is certainly this study predates the current health crisis, and Chris and I, want to acknowledge that and talk about that a little bit through our time here together today. And so we ask that you also reflect on how these conclusions and related recommendations, which Chris is going to go through, might relate to how we're thinking about summer 2020. So our first conclusion is that all children, and really families, all of us, have basic developmental needs that must be met as a precondition to structured summertime programs. And those include nutrition, health, and safety. And that once those needs are met, or as those needs are being met, that summertime experiences can in fact affect academic, health, social and emotional, and safety outcome for children and youth. But for those in less advantageous circumstances are at higher risk for worse outcomes and face more obstacles in accessing high quality summertime experiences. We were, and Chris and I were charged with the systems section of this particular report. I'll just say from my perspective, encouraged by the many opportunities we were able to note and observe to implement innovative programming and extend effective practices that might happen during the school year into the summer. And that's not limited to summer school. That's talking about nutrition programs and after school programs that extend into the summertime. And through all of this, the committee really recognized that it was crucial to elevate the assets and priorities of families and communities in the design, development, and implementation of summertime programs. The last 2 findings, we're confident in these conclusions, but we also need to recognize that research is scarce. And it's scarce for a variety of different reasons. One is simply that summertime is a very short period of time to measure stuff and research stuff. The second, as I noted in our charge, is that the academic domains have been well studied, but the rest haven't been as well studied. So for many of you who know me, know that I would be happy to talk about these last 2 findings around research and federal data systems ad nauseum, but we're not going to cover them today. But they are really important in helping us better understand how children and youth experience summertime. So the committee came up with 9 recommendations, which you'll see in the brief that was sent along with the webinar invitation. And those really fall into three categories. The bolded categories, Chris is going to talk about in a little bit more detail and share his Boston After School and Beyond story, that really entail improving planning, administration, and coordination of summertime experiences. And this is at the local, state, and federal level, and clearly improving availability, access, and equity. The third piece is what I alluded to in the conclusions, is advancing data collection and research. So together, the committee was able to concoct an updated view of summertime, which we're curious how well this resonates with you. But that summer really provides a unique, and I want to emphasize the word unique here, window of opportunity during the year to engage families and leverage the strengths and resources of families, communities, and other stakeholders to improve the education, health, safety, and well-being of children and youth. And so I'm going to paraphrase, I'm going to use my own words, not the words of the committee. Summer is not simply a bridge from one school year to another. It is really an opportunity to take a systemic perspective and approach to supporting young people, families, communities in their journey towards thriving. With that, I'll pass it to Chris to tell us more about the recommendations.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to the Weichert and Forum community for being with us today. It's great to talk about summer at this point in the planning process. Very timely, relevant, and though I'm on this end of the screen, I am happy to share our experience. I'm equally curious what each of you is thinking about the summer and how we put these recommendations to work. Could you advance the slide, please? So Deb mentioned that the committee took a systems approach, and a lot of people say, what does a system mean? And here you see it's that many sectors are involved, but decision-making around summer independently or with limited or no coordination. So the number of players involved, the way decisions are made, the realms in which players operate from education and youth development, but also public health and safety, coupled with the number of actors who are involved. So you think about summer, you think about teachers, youth development specialists, you think about neighborhood nonprofits, sports-based nonprofits, higher education, the business community. It's really an interesting and diverse array of players. And because of that diversity, having a good summer requires planning, administration, and coordination. So not surprisingly, that was a key recommendation of the committee. And it gets a little more specific than that. If you could advance the slide. You'll see that the committee actually concluded that intermediaries play an important role in connecting public, private, and nonprofit entities around shared goals. I'm not going to read the rest of that to you, but if you need proof of that, just consider this call. The forum is playing its role as a national intermediary, bringing together so many diverse organizations around one agenda to talk about this. That happens at the state level as well, and at the local level. We happen to be one such example as a citywide intermediary. There are others who come together through the Every Hour Counts Coalition. So intermediaries can vary, but they all play a similar role in terms of how they function. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see some of the details. The reason that the committee concluded that we need to work together is that there are examples of how this is happening. And so I like to think of intermediary work as professional work. And to that end, the committee felt comfortable recommending that philanthropy should augment their funding and support for intermediaries as part of the infrastructure of serving young people, doing what they know how to do well, which is pulling together resources around shared goals, measuring efforts toward those goals, and measuring and sharing outcomes around the goals, and then finally getting better. And that's what all of you do through your local efforts in collaboration. And I like to think about it as individual programs are incredible, but once you get beyond a single program, it necessitates more coordination. And the guiding principle is that we can do more together than any of us can do alone. And so an intermediary should enhance the collective efforts of different players in the system. And when it comes to summer learning, which is our domain, that means a wide variety of nonprofits working with schools, universities, and others. And to simplify it in a hashtag, which our superintendent, Brenda Caselius, always says, all hands on deck. And just one more point on this, the way Boston After School and Beyond thinks about intermediary work is we try to enhance work that's already happening, not compete with the programs we organize. So to that end, we are fairly disciplined about thinking what we can do together that we can't do alone. If a single agency can do something alone, they should. We step in and coordinate resources where one agency cannot accomplish everything on its own. We think about diversity strengthening our model. So diversity is a strength because kids present so many diverse needs and interests. So it takes a coordinated approach of diverse players to meet the collective needs of our city and presumably of your cities, regions, and states as well. And finally, when we work together through an intermediary, we can get better together. We can understand our relative strengths and weaknesses, not only as individual programs, but also as a city, because we're working together. That enables us to draw on best practices from within our network, to create new solutions and fund them as a network, and to try things together. So there's strength in numbers, there's strength in diversity. So that was a major recommendation that came out of this that I would put in a very tangible space of how we can get this done and what we can do next. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to the issue of summertime and how young people spend their time, when you read the report, you'll see that, not surprisingly, kids do not spend their summer months in the same ways. In fact, it's largely dependent on where they live and family resources, in addition to other aspects of geography. And if you just take one example of what that looks like, consider the average cost of a summer camp, which is $288 a week. Those in the middle class and up spend this routinely to make sure their kids are cared for during the summer, have access and exposure to caring adults, skill building opportunities, and enrichment. That's not necessarily affordable for all young people. And so the committee recommended that we improve availability, access, and equity. And what that looks like is subsidizing summer learning and employment so that it's part and parcel of growing up in America. It's not something that's nice to have, it's something that's necessary to have. And when you think about it in public policy terms, so many young people find their own way to summer programs. In Boston, we work with 100 programs who serve roughly 10,000 kids who find their way to those programs. We then work with them to ensure that we're coordinating efforts and measuring together. But there's some kids who would not find their way to those programs if not for a concerted effort to connect them to those natural settings, museums, workplaces, and neighborhood programs. Nor would it happen if we did not have a public and private subsidy to do so. So like many of you, we raise and deploy public and private resources to ensure that kids who otherwise would not be connected to those programs are connected to those programs. That's a major finding of this. And I think just to pause for a moment and talk about the current situation, when schools are out, parents lose access to childcare, kids lose access to caring adults, to learning opportunities, to skill development opportunities, opportunities to build relationships that then turn into social capital down the road. This happens every year. It's structured into our public school schedule that kids don't have that in the summer. But groups like yours and ours are looking to fill that gap, that discontinuity between school years. So in a way, the COVID crisis is lifting the veil on what's already been. And this is an opportunity to show those who had not noticed before or weren't looking before what's possible. Let me move on to the final recommendation we'll cover today, among others in the report. And that's also specific to summertime and how youth spend it. And this is to promote summer employment for youth. Deb mentioned that we went through lots of literature and research findings. And one area where the research was particularly strong was around the value of summer employment. There were 3 randomized control trials in major cities, Chicago, New York City, and Boston, that found strong effects for those who are connected to summer employment. And those effects are at the community level in terms of public safety and at the student level in terms of skill development and even in some cases, academic performance. So we know this works. We know summer learning works. RAND's comprehensive view of summer learning, a report on summer learning from a couple of years ago called Learning from Summer, documents that high attending participants outperformed their peers by 25% of a school year's worth of learning in math and English language arts. And they also had an advantage over their non-participating peers in social and emotional skills. So coupled together, you see that summer learning and summer employment works. It's been proven. This report shines a light on that work and recommends that we, as a society, invest in the resources to pull together the opportunities that will enable more work and learning so that it's available to all kids, not just some kids who can afford it. I'm going to pause there and turn it back to Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Deborah. So we're going to just start kicking off. This is going to be a great opportunity. I'm going to just start with a couple of questions, but this is really a time and space for our attendees to really start asking, to start drafting some questions, and we'll be reviewing those to ask the panelists. I think one thing that I want to be able to start with is, you know, as you think about the report and the recommendations, what ideas from this report really resonate with each of you the most today, considering as we're looking at this upcoming summer and even looking to the summer that lies ahead due to our health crisis? What are some of the most important things that you think resonate? And whoever can go. Deb, why don't you go first?
Okay, thank you, and thanks, Chris. I enjoyed listening to you. One of the things that struck me as Chris was talking, actually, is that one of the things we've found in the report that is certainly amplified right now are the gross inequities in access to health and nutrition, safety, and enriching opportunities all the time. This has certainly put a magnifying glass on that and made it more varied from state to state, as we all, and city to city and locale to locale, as we all respond to the crisis and deal with essential workers differently. I'm struck by the tension right now between that finding and the recommendation we're looking at on the screen now, where we're seeing local jurisdictions understandably divert resources from things like summer youth employment to services for basic human needs, you know, employment, housing, and nutrition. And really what we're left with is, what are we to do? What are young people to do? I am a parent of teenagers, as many of you know. And this really stands out to me as a critically important issue, as we want to continue to move away from young people engaging in risk and going into systems that we don't want them to be in and they don't want to be in, and into systems that work, as Chris so nicely articulated, like summer youth employment programs. So that tension has always been there in budget decisions. Chris is probably a part of those conversations in Boston, and I think it's even more so right now as we really try to be responsive to families in this current crisis.
Chris, what are any thoughts to be able to add to what Deb was sharing?
Yeah, I think this summer, none of us would disagree, I think, how important summer is as time that could be incredibly well spent and create lasting memories, new skills, new relationships. This summer is at risk, obviously, and in Boston, we're thinking about one, framing just what's possible. It'd be easy to conclude that, well, School buildings are closed for the rest of the school year. We couldn't possibly ramp up. We're doing our best to show that, for example, our zoo, some of our major partners, the YMCA network, are pending public health guidance, willing and able to serve kids under public health parameters and physical distancing guidelines. Of course, we're looking at contingency plans in the event that the time kids get to spend together is abbreviated, or the ways in which they're able to spend time together are restricted, which is a likelihood to some degree. So we're thinking about other ways to stimulate learning, engagement, project-based learning that will serve kids down the line, keep them engaged in the current term, and maybe we could even have something to show for it at the end of the day, like a badge, so that when they look back on this period of time, they'll talk about how they engaged. So all that planning's underway. It's very difficult for programs to plan in an environment of uncertainty. But if you think about it as a muscle that you're developing and then will flex later, I think we're developing different muscles now and thinking about different ways to reach kids in programs and in work so that they can still derive the benefits of this incredible community that we've built over 10 years.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. So I guess a couple of things, as we're, one of the big pieces, we were to go back to, the actual kind of revisited definition, and I'm going to take us back there just for a second so that we can have that in front of us. If we were to go to this updated view of summertime and this unique type of opportunity, and we were to use this as a time, what we're hearing, what I see right here is like really leveraging and using this summertime to imagine kind of what true partnerships would look like, and look at truly kind of even building on the work that's been happening over the past 2 months, how parents and community members and educators and such are all coming together. What are the conversations that are happening? What are some of, maybe even some of the highlights of examples from K-12 and youth orgs partnering together to create more this full day blended learning of opportunities, as we know that summer is going to look different? What are some of your thoughts about that, both of you?
I can provide some cool examples that I've been hearing about. They might be more at the system level than the program level, which might not be satisfying, Jennifer, for your example. So I'll try to take it through for your question. At the system level, I've really seen this current crisis accelerate collaboration in a way that I hadn't seen before. I'm a part of the After School Technical Assistance Collaborative. We work with the 50 state after school network. And for example, there's the state of Georgia, the statewide after school network in Georgia, are bringing together, several other networks to create a toolkit to support social and emotional learning during the summer. And the tools are really intended to be digestible. Chris could do them at home with his kids. An older young person could do it with a younger, person, or a youth worker could execute it. So they're meant to be really flexible and digestible. I think about Stephanie Jones' kernels of practice. They're not as research-based yet, but I bet they could be. So I'm really excited about that, because state by state, we're seeing such differences. So when I see states coming together to develop something for programs, it makes me feel really optimistic that you could see yourself in that work and want to carry out that work. We've also seen large national organizations like 4-H put all their tools and resources up and available for free, so that 4-H programs can pick those up, but our Parks and Rec program or a faith-based program could pick them up as well. I don't think I should be gossiping on a webinar with 1,000+ people, but I have heard that 21st Century Community Learning Center programs, which are by design diverse, both academically and promoting enrichment, will have more flexibility in where those programs could be offered. And if you can imagine with social distancing that we can't have the same number of young people and staff in one physical space, with that flexibility, you could extend into the community, into a school that's not being used over the summer, or a faith-based, building that's not being used during the day. And so I think it's those types of collaborations that I'm seeing that I'm very encouraged by. And Chris, I'm sure you have others from Boston and the other partners in Every Hour Counts.
Yeah, in fact, we've surveyed all of the about 170 programs we work with during the school year to ask, what are you doing now that school buildings are closed? And the response has been incredible. You see the resourcefulness and creativity and dedication of our program network, who are finding ways to reach kids so that they're in touch and engaged and feel some connection. But some of them are continuing programs virtually. And, you know, they're doing all sorts of what we now call synchronous and asynchronous learning from, I'll give you two examples that I thought were interesting. Harlem Lacrosse made sure that every one of the kids in its network has a lacrosse stick and ball at home. So that's something you can practice and do on your own in small ways. Mm-hmm. It's certainly not as good as the real thing, but it's something. And then we're looking at resources that are available to our network and beyond. So the New England Aquarium has made a point, and the Franklin Park Zoo as well. Although they're closed to the public and visitors, they have to feed the animals every day. So they have made the most of those opportunities when the staff at the aquarium or the zookeepers are there feeding the animals to do live events and events that can be shared later for kids all across the city and beyond. And as we plan for summer, we're coming to saying, just as we had gotten really good at program practices to ensure that programs are performing well, we have to learn an additional set of practices around distancing, around hygiene, around plans for quarantining kids. So this is forcing this network of programs to incorporate a new set of practices, to say nothing of how you fund that and operationalize it. And similarly, if you look at youth employment, one thing nobody wants to see is kids lose access to work, but also the wages they were planning on. So employers, both in the public sector and the private sector, are finding ways for young people to work, if they're not able to come together in person, to do work remotely through digital tasks that are individual and in person. So they still get the benefit of contributing something for a paycheck. So it's been great. And this is where the value of a network really comes to life. You see such creativity in all corners that I could give you examples for the rest of the afternoon on what people are doing. I should say on our website, it's called Enrichment at Home. It shows you a sample of what some organizations are doing now.
Chris, I don't mean to be competitive, but have you seen the penguins from the Shed Aquarium in Chicago? Because they're giving tours of the aquarium virtually.
I have not, but I'll check that out.
You should. It's pretty fun. We've been following it as a family.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the idea of having to look at programming and kind of support programming in this virtual means, and a whole different set of quality standards and practices that have not been things that we've had to really explore. I'm interested in hearing, and I see some in terms of the chat, what are some of the things that but people are exploring when they're looking at those practices or having those conversations of how to support, whether from an intermediary or even Deb, some of the conversations that you might be having through your ATAC support. What are people thinking? How are they approaching that?
Well, I mean, it ranges certainly. We're seeing states like Alaska, you know, starting in-person summer programming, and I'm sure they'll be following the CDC guidelines on opening, which I think are coming out if they're not out already. I think they were slated for the end of April. I encourage folks to check those out. To places that are more impacted, like cities. I live in Chicago, like my own. We're not close to opening up, and so we're seeing programs offering kits, whether they're, you know, blended learning where it's partially virtual to, you know, an actual box kit that a parent or a youth work staff could pick up and do with a young person, to things getting mailed home in rural areas, STEM kits and, you know, arts and craft kits. It doesn't replace the relational aspect that we all herald and is research backed to make the biggest difference in young people's lives. But Chris and I were sharing before this call, you know, there's just also these old-fashioned methods of picking up the phone, texting, or engaging where appropriate, through social media with young people, youth work staff, and with young people, and checking in how they're doing. We've heard that's been very, very effective and appreciative in programs. So it's really ranging based on digital access, geography, state status in reopening. And in addition to the CDC guidelines, I always want to offer resources if folks haven't seen the Council of Chief State School Officers, people say CCSSO a lot, has offered a framework for schools reopening. And of course, our role in the allied youth fields with K through 12 is to understand what they're going through and be a good partner to them as they endeavor to reopen in the fall and beyond. So I would think about that too. We're talking about summer, but we're really talking about, the next 12 to 18 months.
Yes, and I'll just add to that in a similar way. Jennifer Peck in the chat called out that when we get together, if we're able to get together, it's likely to be in small groups. Mm-hmm. So we asked programs 3 weeks ago, summer programs, what are you thinking for the summer? In what ways are you flexible? We were planning for the high end because we want to be ready for any scenario, but we want to especially be ready if we can get back together in person. We don't want to be caught on our heels if we can move forward. So we want to be on our toes. And we asked programs, would you be flexible in when you'd offer the program? Could you make use of all 10 weeks of summer? Would you be willing to hold it at a different location? Would you be willing to, rather than serve a cohort of 60 kids, cycle through 1,000 kids to your resource if you're a park or a reservation? And we asked, what would you need to do this? So we've boiled it down to, programs are willing to be flexible, cooperative, and part of the solution. But eventually they have to make decisions. So while some programs have made the decision to go remote already, some are hanging in there to do limited in-person activity. And that has us focused specifically on how to work with small groups of kids. How do you stagger their arrival and where they go from there? How do you get them there? A lot of programs say, well, we have space once kids get here, but how do we get them there? So we're trying to think through, what does it look like to have buses that are a third or a half full, bringing kids to places? Who pays for that? And then all the PPE concerns. How do we get hand sanitizer and washing stations and masks and everything else programs will need in a coordinated way? In Boston, the YMCA has remained open for emergency childcare. So they've learned quite a bit on the fly about how to do this. And we actually had a webinar yesterday with our partner network where the Y shared some of how to do this. So we envision we'll have a few tracks of learning. One for those programs who still want to do in-person learning, should they be permitted to do so. Another on remote learning. And then one focused on the particular needs of teens who in some cases are planning to work, but will have different needs than younger kids.
Thanks, Chris. One thing that you mentioned and really in terms of some of the initial inquiries that you were doing with the organizations about kind of the changes and such that they'd be willing to consider, and in particular being able to serve more, was just interested in some of the partnerships, whether it's like libraries or rec departments, those places that may have maybe supporting more equitable access to programmings and offerings, and maybe others. Where are, in terms of the conversations that you've been having, or Deb, that you've been hearing about these entities where there is more equitable access? Will they be more relied on for this summer? What is that looking like, and as a way to be able to serve more youth and families?
Deb's pointing to me. So yeah, we have a huge variety in our network. And it's a tricky discussion because everyone wants what you want to do now, you're not allowed to do in order to keep people safe. So it's been tough, but I would say that the focus from the get-go, the day schools were closed in mid-March, the superintendent was in touch with us about what can we do together to make sure our kids, particularly our most vulnerable kids, have access to our resources, including the ones you enumerated, Jennifer, plus others? How do we think about them now so that when we get a green light, we're ready to go? And so we are starting to think about different groups and what they'll need in particular, what their specific needs are. And, you know, just a lot of blocking and tackling, where can kids get to, how do you make the best use of your public facilities if they're open, including parks, libraries, other places. We're focused a lot on where we have open space, knowing that we're going to have some parameters around distancing and a pent-up need to get outside.
And I'm realizing, listening to Chris, and no offense to us, we're both quite city-centric, and so I just want to acknowledge that. In Chicago and in Illinois, the governor has allowed a 30% increase in child care subsidies for those working in community-based settings, supporting and providing opportunities for children of essential workers. They've also made the parent or family contribution $1, I think, for essential workers. So I think there are efforts being made. Is it sufficient? I mean, I don't know. I don't know the data on that, but I do know from my friends and national youth serving organizations that it's a hard time. It's a hard time to stay open. It's a hard time to serve kids. And and it's, you know, particularly hard in my observation for those organizations and programs that might be a single site program, might not have the support of a wonderful intermediary like Boston After School and Beyond, or be a part of a national affiliate organization. And so I think some of the organizations many of us have depended on for summer are also experiencing the challenges of the current economy and have had to close. And I think that's a reality, Jennifer, as we think about, you know, equitable access moving ahead, and something I know many of us, you know, care deeply about as we think beyond 18 months into building it better.
Thank you. So I'm looking, there's tons of questions coming through, and I'm looking at those and doing the best to be able to address. So I guess one of the pieces, you know, as we looked at one of the questions as it relates to equity, it was one of the areas that was addressed within the reports, and how, you know, Chris talked about, you know, removing the veil, removing it even further from the dark space that others had been seeing. So as we magnify the inequities within our systems and work, especially for the youth who continue to face these opportunity gaps and those who have been historically marginalized, what ideas do you have? And even thinking about ideas of what we've been trying to experience in the past couple of months to help us move forward in trying to minimize these disparities and eradicate this as best as we can. What are some new things that are coming to mind?
I'm going to be generic and let Chris be specific, if that's okay with you, Chris. I'm hearing from a lot of our partners, and I was listening with wide ears to Chris's description of what programs are doing in Boston, that because of the flexibility that programs are having to offer young people and the ratios they need to achieve, that we're going to see a lot more multi-age programming. And so I think as we think about older youth and potentially gaps in summer youth employment programs, can we think about opportunities within those multi-age programs to engage older young people, older youth, in the leadership or co-facilitation of those programs? I mean, I think that's, you know, an innovation that we've all heralded and wanted to see in programs. It certainly doesn't take the place of summer youth employment, but it gives young people a role that's appropriate when they're in the same space as a 7-year-old person. So I think that's one thing. I do think the blended learning that we're experiencing, you know, maybe we would have gotten to it eventually. It does not take the place of in-person, you know, relationship building and hands-on activities, but it does allow us to innovate a little bit and learn more as a professional workforce, how to stay connected with young people when they're not in the program.
Yeah, I guess I'd add, and A friend of mine once said, I thought in a very clear way, relationships are built on shared experiences. And even though our shared experiences aren't in person, you can build on what we're all going through together. I saw something, now I have to give credit to Chicago here. We have a Becoming a Man chapter, BAM, started in Chicago, in Boston, and thriving now. And I was on a meeting with the young people from that. And it's just an incredible way not only to connect, but to name, recognize, and accept emotions. And you could see even on a 50-person Zoom call, how many different emotions kids are feeling, but how many of them were in common. And it's just such a well-facilitated program and group that I thought that was pretty interesting. And what BAM did in a concerted way was to bring in people like me and others who wouldn't be part of everyday youth circles to see a good social and emotional learning practice. You know, usually it's an in-person circle. To see it done on a Zoom call, I thought was great. And it makes you think how much more of that we could do without the constraints of transportation and being in person. So I think all of us are recognizing some things that could be done maybe better, certainly more cheaply and for more people if we can leverage our new online community and skills.
Well, and we're catching up with the young people in programs, right? I mean, I've seen some of these great webinars. I think the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning I saw has also some great young people from Chicago joining their webinar in the next week or two. And, you know, this is their platform, right? And so it's a great way for us to, as a field, enter into that space while maintaining the spirit of relationships and safe and supportive environments.
Thanks, Deb. Chris, I have a question for you as it relates to intermediaries. And we have actually a lot of intermediaries represented on today's call. And so just really interested, at the very beginning, you talked what an intermediary does, and you mentioned about what the work that Boston After School has been doing in terms of that space. I'm interested in knowing over the past couple of months and even looking into the summer ahead, where have you seen any opportunities, like where have you continued to kind of leverage the strengths that you really have that you think are really important as we transition to the summer? And are there any new opportunities or things that you've been involved in that just haven't been part of your work in the past as we look at some of these changing times?
And I see a question as well about what is an intermediary. So there are intermediaries in different domains, different fields, serving different purposes. In our world, it's to connect resources and opportunities for the benefit of young people. That's very broadly defined. And I think as you ask a stakeholder group, what does your intermediary do? I suspect in Boston, the superintendent would say that Boston Beyond is a window into hundreds of after-school and summer programs that I may not be able to manage one-on-one. If you ask an individual program, they would say we are a window into a network and data that they can use and learn from. So it depends who you ask. But that's a great question, Jennifer. In some ways, it's helped us double down on what we've cared about. So our major issue areas are obviously after school and summer learning, but also STEM and project-based learning. And as I discussed with my team, that one positive thing about this crisis is that our issues are now front and center. It doesn't take a whole lot of explanation to describe the importance of these issues and why they're needed. And so, yeah, I think it's obviously pulling us into the virtual and remote space in ways we hadn't thought about before, but that will serve us better down the line. I mean, if you imagine a situation in the fall where we have to close down again, we want to be ready for that. We want to have the best of what's available in person available remotely. And so it's good that the general public sees the need for this work, and it really calls upon which is our greatest strength, which is our network of programs. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't take much to get the Y, the Boys and Girls Club, sports-based programs, the city and the schools together, because they all know one another already. And it's good to have those relationships in place when you need them. And I think that's what people are valuing now. How do we bring a bunch of people together who can think through a solution and try something quickly?
Thanks, Chris. Hey, Deb, any other additional kind of insight that you have as it relates to the work that you might be doing with the networks that you've been hearing from any of those conversations around pivots or opportunities to grow, stretch in this space?
Well, I think it's certainly front and center that after school and summer programs want to be sure that they are supporting young people's learning and development now more than ever, and that this period right now is a time when there are more likely to be young people experiencing stress and trauma, that they might have family members who have been impacted or who have maybe lost their job. And so, to Chris's point about intermediaries, after school programs have always been connectors. We've always been, able to engage with young people and their families authentically. And even sometimes when families don't feel comfortable going to school day personnel, they'll feel comfortable going to after school program professionals and leaders. And so right now, I'm hearing from the networks that programs are eager, and hearing from families that they need help, and that after school programs can be a resource for that help. So not saying after school programs have to do it all, and that staff need to be mental health professionals and, understand trauma-informed care and, be an employment office, but that we are connected through these intermediaries, through these after school networks, and we can help families get what they need during this time of crisis. It's similar around nutrition, right? We saw handoffs when schools closed. We saw handoffs of, food, free and reduced price meals go mostly to everybody. And they mostly were distributed from community centers and faith-based centers and communities. So I think those partnerships we're hearing about through the after school networks, and we're hearing that the networks like Boston After School and Beyond in Boston are really trying to amp up their efforts to support programs as they take on that sort of Herculean task and making sure children and families have what they need as they experience this very difficult time.
Thanks, Deb. We've been talking a lot about the youth and families, and we also have a whole field of youth workers that have the weight of a lot of this work and the constant learning, just like youth and adults. Everyone's transitioning in this learning. I'm wondering, in terms of the conversations that have been happening in your circles, about how is now and how we're moving forward, how are we really supporting the field, and what are the strategies and ways that we're building and strengthening everybody as we go through this period?
I can tell you what we've done. We've been more connected than ever in some ways. We've started a weekly partner newsletter just so that we could learn from what one another is doing during this time, keeping them up to date on and trying to distill some of the information that's coming forward. We're now starting to do professional development online, and believe it or not, we've actually continued with our work on program observations. So we're doing virtual program observations, which I wouldn't have said was a thing 3 months ago, but it's actually possible to do this. So our partners haven't missed a beat. They want to keep working, keep doing the professional work that makes them so good at what they do. And even in places where they've had to furlough or lay off people, they want to put the remaining staff to use. And so over the next, we're starting a weekly series like this where we can bring a speaker and information and insight. Next week's is with Gil Noem from PAIR, talking about mental health issues and how to address them related to COVID and what reentry might look like. We've done similar sessions with high-level people from the Boston Public Schools, knowing that they're learning as they go and building as they fly, but keeping everyone engaged with what's happening. And as I mentioned earlier, we've engaged them in planning, so it's forward-looking as well. And I think as a result, nobody has as much free time as they might have thought at the beginning of this closure, but people are busier than ever. So we're going to roll out all of our PD, obviously online in May and June. And just to give you a flavor of what that looks like, we're doing one on social and emotional skills. We're doing one on the district's academic program. And we're doing one on project-based learning, how you bring those two domains together in person and remotely.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for outlining those supports. How exciting to know that that work, and of course the passion is still there and the work to continue to move forward. Deb, any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been overwhelmed in a good way, goosebump overwhelmed with all of the efforts to keep people connected and for professional learning and development. We saw the National After School Association, who unfortunately had to change their conference very early in the crisis, go to a virtual convening. We've seen, Ready by 21, have an offering, was that last week. So people have shifted very quickly from, really rich in-person convenings to opportunities for people to share. I think the chat box, which I'm having trouble, watching, is an example of just how people are so eager to share their innovations and learn from other people. And to that end, we've seen a lot of communities of practice, again, within the after school networks. We see community practice around topics of interest where networks are working together to solve problems of practice. And I recently learned of Learning Heroes has been convening all of the national family organizations, so PTA and UPOs, to simply do this kind of sharing to talk about families' needs and resources right now. So I'm encouraged by how our field has really rallied, and as Chris said, didn't decide to take this time as a time off, but to actually get closer together and learn from each other.
Thanks. Thank you, Deb. So we have lots of questions. One thing that I will note in our last couple of minutes is that we are going to be downloading these questions in forms of the chat, and we will be responding some of them in terms of the general themes, so you'll be able to get those answers. And I think one of the things that I'm going to end in terms of our last couple of minutes is kind of piggybacking off of your idea as it relates to what you're encouraged by. What you're encouraged, though we're in a, though we are in a situation in terms of this upcoming summer that is still uncertain. As you think about this summer, what makes you hopeful despite the uncertainty this summer and even looking forward? What are the things that you're most hopeful about?
I mean, I'm hopeful that we can share everything that we know about summer, which really did stem from creativity and innovation of staff and connecting, as Chris and I learned through the consensus study, connecting sometimes in formal ways through intermediaries or in other ways to offer opportunities for young people to learn and develop that might not look like last year or next year, but that still are deeply rooted in a sense of physical and emotional safety and opportunities to have positive relationships and explore something new. I mean, so I think we can do it. We're a creative field, and we've pivoted several times in the past, perhaps never like this. But I think the time of summertime is exactly our time to be creative and make sure that happens.
Yeah, I would say in a similar vein, this is an opportunity to step up to a big challenge where we're doing so in a visible way. Schools had to do it over the past 2 months unexpectedly. We have the benefit of learning what worked there, what didn't work, and to improve it very quickly for this summer. It's hard. It's especially hard not knowing what you're permitted to do. But I think by exercising these muscles around collaboration and innovation and planning, that in itself is worthwhile. And whatever we're able to do in summer, we're going to be stronger on the back end because of these efforts together.
Thanks, Chris. And there's some hopeful statements that are in our chat too. Eager to learn in this new normal way, eager to deepen partnerships. We talked about that, creating new partnerships. There's also other pieces in here as it relates to virtual that we didn't get a chance to be able to talk to, but I think we can connect offline about how to some of the things that you talked about, Chris, around being able to assess some of the virtual offerings. That's a new thing that people are excited to be able to learn about and such. So we will make sure that that we download this chat and do our best to be able to respond. There was also a lot of other resources, so we're eager to be able to share some of the resources that people shared, so that you can be able, as participants and guests, that we can all be able to learn from one another. So I just want to take the moment to be able to thank everybody for their time. Thank for lending your expertise, being part of the conversation. There is a lot to happen, but once again, hopeful for what we can learn from this report, hopeful how we can leverage the strengths that we've been doing, and just appreciate everybody for this conversation. So enjoy your day, enjoy your Friday, and we look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Thank you, everyone. Quickly download the chat.
Yeah, I've saved it into the folder.
Oh, you did? Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
So.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you. And we'll follow. I think what we'll do is we'll follow up. There's a lot of thanks, everyone. A lot of thanks going on. Great attendance, and appreciate you all in terms of being able to. Yes, there will be a recording. We'll follow up with some of the questions and such. Chris, maybe you can help direct us to some more of those resources. But thank you both for lending your time.
Happy to. Thanks, Jennifer. Bye-bye.
Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.